Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're getting started a couple minutes late. Hopefully, almost everyone has joined at this point. The purpose of today's webinar is to give you, hopefully, a better understanding of how LogicMonitor's alert routing system works. It's a very powerful system, and if you understand how to use it, it can accommodate for basically any scenario you need to, but it tends to be a point of confusion for a lot of clients, both new and older. So we're going to walk through a few examples today to illustrate some of the very important points of alert routing. My name is Victoria Udine, and I'm an account manager here at LogicMonitor. So I work with a lot of new clients, and I get to see a lot of accounts early on, and I see the way they have their alert routing set up. Because it does tend to be an area of confusion, we're going to go through a few common scenarios and hopefully have a better understanding of how everything works and how you should be managing that part of your account. So LogicMonitor predefined thresholds should be viewed kind of as an intelligent starting point for knowing what needs your attention in your network. But as you've probably found, they're not going to be a perfect match for all network environments. So tuning the alert thresholds definitely comes into play when we're looking at the subject of alert routing. And today's webinar is not going to focus specifically on tuning thresholds, but I'll briefly touch on that a little bit. And then if you are interested in getting more into that subject, or if you'd like some one-on-one training or any help figuring out what thresholds you should adjust, just send an email to clientservices@logicmonitor.com, or you can contact me directly. I'll send out my contact information after this webinar, and we can schedule a call for you. The focus today, like I said, is going to be purely on how to handle the routing of alerts so that you're not being overloaded with alert notifications and that you are getting notified of everything you need to be. So hopefully you've had a chance at this point to glance through that list. There's two major components of alert routing, the escalation chains and the rules. The escalation chains are the various groups of recipients that need to be notified when an alert is triggered. And then the rules are what determine which alerts go to which chains. So you have to have both of these set up in order to receive any notifications at all. When your account is first created, this is what the default escalation chain looks like. It's just one chain, it's called default, and it has no recipients in the destination, as you can see. And here's what the alert rules look like for all brand new accounts. So it's very important to understand that in LogicMonitor, the rules are filters. So the system checks through them in order of priority, beginning with 1 as the highest priority. And as soon as an alert matches a given rule, the system is going to send the notification to whatever escalation chain is associated with that rule, and it does not continue to check against the remaining rules that have a lower priority. The way accounts are configured by default, every alert that has the severity level of warning is going to be caught by this first rule called warn, and then the notifications for those are going to go to whatever escalation chain is associated with warn. So in this case right now there aren't any recipients, so it's not going to go anywhere. If an alert is not warning level, meaning it's error or critical, then it's not going to match the warn rule, so then the system will check it against the next highest priority rule, which is 100. So that means the rule called all will match only alerts with severity levels of critical and error. So like I said, I see the way a lot of new clients have their account routing set up, or sorry, their alert routing set up. And sometimes clients will opt out of the initial training session and then they contact me a few months down the road because they're not happy with the way their alerts are being routed. And I talk to both people who have missed an important alert because their rules weren't configured correctly, or other times I'll hear from people that are getting everything emailed or texted to them. And so they tell me they aren't even really looking at the emails from LogicMonitor anymore because they just cannot keep up with the sheer volume. So I commonly see new accounts that have their alert routing configured something like this. And this is what happens if you simply add a recipient to the default escalation chain. Then that recipient immediately starts receiving an email and a text message, or even a phone call sometimes, for every single alert that's triggered in the account. In the case you see here, they're going to be getting an email and an SMS text message right off the bat for warnings, errors, and criticals. And then the errors and criticals are all going to resend every 30 minutes because you can see that there's that resend interval set. So that's definitely a good way to get too many emails. A lot of times people will find that they're being flooded, and so this is another very common scenario that I see in new accounts. Often clients start with routing everything and then they realize the sheer volume of alerts that are being generated, so they'll decide to only route critical, and they'll essentially ignore everything else. Setting up your alert routing based only on the predefined priority levels is not the best way to do it, especially if it means you're only going to be paying attention to the critical alerts and ignoring everything else. LogicMonitor does provide information to help you optimize your whole network, and it gives you very detailed insight into every component of your network that's operating outside of normal or healthy behavior, and that's according to manufacturer guidelines or industry best practices. But as you've probably realized if you've been using LogicMonitor for some time, in many cases, getting an email or a text for everything that goes slightly wrong is probably not the best way to take advantage of the information. Our preset alert thresholds tend to be set at levels that are intended for critical production devices, so they assume that you want to know every detail of anything that goes wrong. And this is probably not the case for something in your dev or your QA environment. The first thing that you should do when you're setting up your alert routing and your account is to create a user account for everyone that's involved in the day-to-day network operations. This makes it a whole lot simpler to configure escalation chains, and we're going to get to that in a moment. If there are people that need to receive text messages or phone calls for certain types of incidents, they have to be set up with a user account first. So email alerts can be sent to addresses that don't have user accounts, but voice and text alerts do require a user account. In order to do this, you should think about just how your network runs from a practical standpoint and who are the people that are in charge of the different aspects. You can edit the user profiles by clicking the pencil icon, so let's just take a look in here. Like I said, anyone that wants to receive a text alert or a voice call alert needs to have their phone number and SMS information set up in the user profile. So entering a cell phone number in here does not mean that LogicMonitor is going to start sending alert notifications to that number, but when we start configuring escalation chains, you'll see how this comes into play. And this is the same thing for the phone number field. If you might potentially want to receive phone calls for any type of alert, you do need to have that phone number in the user profile. So you can see here that we've entered SMS addresses and phone numbers for all of these users. In today's webinar, I'm going to be using recipient groups for almost all of the escalation chains that I show. But keep in mind you do not have to use recipient groups. It will keep things simpler for the purpose of this webinar, and I'll quickly show you how these have been configured. You can create and edit your recipient groups under the Settings tab in the Other Alert Settings menu. And when you add recipients to a recipient group, or when you're adding individual recipients to an escalation chain, you'll notice that if you've configured the user profiles correctly, there's going to be an email, a voice call, and an SMS text option for each user. So if there was an email address I wanted to include that did not have a user account, I could just put it in that arbitrary emails box at the bottom. And so then because I have added phone numbers for all my users, you can see their phone numbers are all options in the list. So I zoomed in so you can see it a bit more easily. I've configured these recipient groups according to the responsibilities at a hypothetical company that we're going to be working with, for example. The best way to demonstrate a lot of these points here is to walk through an example from start to finish. So let's imagine a scenario, and we're going to have a company with 3 data center locations, London, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. And then they also have 2 main office locations where their employees are based. And each of those locations has a network team that's responsible for maintaining the production data centers. So the California team handles maintenance of all the West Coast office locations in the LA data center, and the DC team is responsible for the DC East Coast data center and also the UK data center. So we'll go back to our account setup, and we've entered the SMS and voice call info for anyone that might need that kind of alert notification. And then I've set up a recipient group for the people in each of these teams. So now we need to go back and look at our escalation chains. These are also accessed in the Settings tab. All of the alert routing is configured within the Settings section of your account. Instead of adding recipients to the default escalation chain, I'm actually going to add a new chain. So I'll click Add in the top right corner. And then I'm going to name this East Coast Email and Text. It's important to give your escalation chains names that make sense with what they're doing. So I'll click Add Stage, And in this case, I've already put everyone into recipient groups, as you can see in that bottom section. So we're just going to add a recipient group instead of adding an individual person. You could definitely instead choose to add all of the individual contact information to the chain. It works fine either way. And so I'll set this escalation chain up starting with the East Coast NOC team's email addresses, and then I'll just click Save to save that first stage of my chain. Remember that the escalation chain on its own is not going to do anything. This is just the way that we're establishing different groups that we can send these various alerts to. So here's my East Coast chain. It's called Email Then Text, and it has the first stage with just the email addresses. LogicMonitor does have a true escalation process so that people will be notified after the first group of recipients if the condition exists for too long. So in this example, I'm going to add a stage, and I'll put the East Coast NOC team's SMS addresses as a recipient group and their email addresses. So the way the escalation process works, this alert that I send here is going to route to the first stage recipient, which is email, and then after a time interval that we're going to specify in the alert rule, it will notify the recipients on the next stage. Here we have everyone on the East Coast in the NOC team that will be emailed first, then a period of time passes and the condition is still effective, and then they're going to be emailed again and text messaged. And I'm going to quickly do the same thing for our West Coast team. So I'll click Add to add another chain, and then I'll add the West NOC email recipients to the first stage, and a second stage that includes email and SMS. So I have my East email text chain and the West email text chain, but right now nothing is going to either of those. So the escalation chains, remember, are only the series of recipients. On their own, they're going to just sit there and not do anything at all. In order for it to become essentially active, it needs a rule to tell the system what to send to it. So we'll look at the alert rules now. It's also going to let the system know how frequently to remind the recipients when each type of alert occurs. When an alert goes into effect, the system will look at the attributes of the alert, and then it's going to go through all of the rules in order of priority, starting with 1, until it finds a rule that matches. An alert can only be associated with one rule, and as soon as it finds a match, then the system is going to send it to the escalation chain associated with that rule, and it does not continue to check against the remaining rules. So here you can see that the default rules are based only on severity level, and they have everything else wild-carded. So that means any alert from any group, any host, any data source, and any data point is going to match the rule warn, as long as the alert severity level is warning, and then the all rule is going to catch everything besides warning. So again, an alert can only match on one alert rule, and it doesn't even check against the ones with lower priorities. I mentioned earlier that the default escalation chain can sometimes be dangerous, and that's because both of these two catch-all rules are set to send to that chain. So if we did add a recipient here, then that's going to send everything to that recipient. So it's important to give the escalation chains names that make sense, that express what they are. So let's edit the default chain, and we're going to call it empty. And we're not going to add any recipients because it's actually helpful to keep an empty escalation chain to set as a destination for the alerts that you want to filter out. And we'll look at that in a minute and see why that's useful. Before we start to set up the alert rules, they're very powerful, but they can get complicated, so we should look at the way the rest of the account is set up. And you should have your alert routing in mind when you configure your host groups, because this makes it a whole lot cleaner and simpler. We'll look at the Hosts tab, and you can see I have everything grouped based on whether it's production, dev, or QA, and then also by equipment type. So devices can be in multiple groups, and that's important to remember as well. So I might have a router that's in a group both based on its physical location and then also in a group based on the fact that it's a router. Within this production group, I have subgroups for the main physical locations of my production environment. And this is, again, based on the teams that are really responsible for these. Each of the groups has subgroups that are set based on equipment types and also locations. This makes it very easy for me to handle the routing of alerts for storage devices differently than for routers, for instance. Or if I wanted to route the alerts for the DC data center differently than for the Cleveland office alerts, I could do that easily as well. Obviously, that's the same in this US West subgroup. I have the 3 location groups and then subgroups within this data center group. So I can either look at everything within one location, or I can break it down by the type of equipment. So now that we've seen that folder structure, we'll go ahead and go back to the settings tab and then look at our alert rules again with this in mind. For now, instead of editing these 2 default rules, I'm going to leave those there, and I'll click Add in the top corner, and I'll create a new rule that's going to handle all of the alerts that are triggered within the East Coast production equipment, and it's going to send them to the East Coast NOC team that's responsible for all of these devices. So I'll call it US East Production, and like I said earlier, you really want to make sure to give your escalation chains names that make sense with the rules that are routing to them, and vice versa. In this case, and pretty much in every alert rule that you create, the priority is very, very important. I need to give this rule a higher priority than the 2 default rules because I want to make sure the system looks at this before it looks at those catch-alls. I'll set the priority in this case at 30, and you'll see why I chose that number in a moment. And I also want to route alerts for devices in the US East group with this rule. So I'll specify production for the parent group, and then a slash, and then US East for the subgroup, followed by an asterisk. All of these fields will allow you to use regex or glob expressions. So basically, I'm wildcarding it, so any child group within this group is going to match this rule. And I'll leave everything else wildcarded so that the rule will match any alert from any host in that group, regardless of which data source and data point the alert came from. The recent interval of 30 minutes means it's going to be 30 minutes between the initial email that goes out to the NOC team and then the second email and the SMS message. So in that 30 minutes, if one of them replies to the email with ACK, that's going to acknowledge the alert, and that suppresses the routing. And that means the text will not go out at all. So obviously, I will change the destination here for this rule to my US East email and text recipient, since that's who I want to get these. And now I have an alert rule with a higher priority than anything else in the account. And since the rules are filters, like I said before, this is going to catch any alert at all in the US East subgroup within my production group. So for an alert on a device in any of the other groups, it's obviously not going to match this rule. So then the system is going to check it against the next highest priority rule, which in this case has no recipient, so they're not going to be routed anywhere. And then I need to do the same thing for my West group. As a best practice, even when you have very similar rules, you do not need to set duplicate priorities. In this case, the US West and US East rules hypothetically would be mutually exclusive. So no host is going to be in both groups, and that means no alert is going to match both rules. So in cases where the rules are completely mutually exclusive, technically you could assign duplicate priorities, but we recommend against it. And the point is that there is never a need to do that. So alerts that are in the US West group are never going to match the rule that's specific to the East group. So even though this new rule has a lower priority, the alerts for the West group are still going to route correctly. The other thing that you should not do is assign priority numbers that are sequential. So instead of giving this rule a priority of 29 or 31, I'm going to put 40. This makes it so that if I do need to add rules to filter additional alerts and route them differently or have a different resend interval, I can put them in without having to edit the priorities of any of the existing rules. So like I said, I'm going to do 40 for the priority, so it's higher than my catch-all rules. And then I set the parent group to production, the child group to US West, and I wildcard everything under that group. And now I have my US East rule picking up everything in that group and going to the East Coast escalation chain. And anything from the West group, the system will first check against the attributes of the East Coast rule, since it does have the highest priority, but it doesn't match that one. So then it checks against the next highest priority, which is the West rule, and this is a match. So every alert notification within that group is going to be sent to everyone on the West team via email, and then after 30 minutes, it will go out again by SMS and email. And it's going to keep resending to that second stage every 30 minutes until it's acknowledged. So if you want an escalation process, but you do not want the notification to continue resending, you would want to just add an additional stage that has nobody in it. So that empty third stage would mean you can have it escalate those 2 times, but then the resends would not go to anyone. So we'll do one more rule very quickly for our UK data center. And I mentioned that that data center in our scenario is handled by the East Coast team. So I'll choose that for my escalation chain. For the priority, I can choose anything I want, but I want to make sure it's a higher priority than 90, since that's my catch-all rule. So I'm going to do 35 in this case, so that the 3 similar rules are pretty close together, but not sequential. Here's the rules I have for production alerts. But look at how this is set up, and this is an important point. We have 2 rules that are associated with the same escalation chain, and they have the same resend interval. So another best practice is to keep your rules more manageable by keeping the number to a minimum. So if you can accomplish the same thing with fewer rules, do it, if at all possible. So in this case, we have the resend interval the same and the escalation chain the same, so we can combine these into one rule. So I'll go ahead and delete this UK production rule, and then I'll edit the East Coast production rule. Obviously, I could also delete the East rule and edit the UK rule. It would make no difference. So in the group field, I now want to include everything in the US East and the UK groups. So I've just added a pipe character, and that will act as an and you can do that in all of these fields. So I have everything in the US East group and its subgroups, and everything in the UK group and its subgroups. So now I've accomplished the exact same alert routing with only 2 rules instead of 3. And that's simple enough, just doing it by the host group, but it does definitely get more involved, and there's usually the need to route based on different criteria than that. So let's expand on the scenario, and we're going to say that the hypothetical company also has a database team who's responsible for the company's SQL servers and databases, regardless of location. So everything that is SQL database related for both the East and the West Coast data centers are going to be handled by that team. So we'll assume I've already added them as users and set up a recipient group that includes them. Now I need to create a new escalation chain. So we'll call it DB admins. I won't go through the process in detail again of adding the stages. So here's the new escalation chain with 2 stages. You can see that first, the database team recipients will be emailed, and then after whatever time interval I pick within the alert rule, they'll get an email and a text. So now I need a rule to route anything SQL related to these guys. So I'll go back over to the rules and add a new rule. We really need to pay attention to priority in this situation. And like I said, pretty much every rule you create, the priority is key. So the priority we set here is going to make a very big difference for which alerts are routed to this chain. If I give it a priority of 50, that's a lower priority than the US East, West, and UK rules. That means that only the SQL-related alerts for the non-production group are actually going to match this rule. So remember that an alert only matches one rule. So as soon as it's found a match, that's it. So if I assign this a priority higher than 30, that would make it so that all of the SQL-related alerts are going to match this rule, and they're going to go to the database team, and they're not going to be routed to the NOC teams. So in that case, the NOC teams would receive everything except for the database alerts for everything in the production group. So let's assume that that second scenario is how we want it. So we're going to say the database team does take care of anything SQL related. Everything else is handled by the respective NOC team. So I need to make sure to give this a priority higher than 30. And again, not sequential, so I'm going to do 20. In this scenario, it does not matter what host or group the alert came from. We just want it to be SQL related. So as a best practice, and kind of as general knowledge, if you want to do any sort of rule that's for a specific type of alert, not based on the device or the location, then you need to use that data source field. Data sources, if you've worked with LogicMonitor, you probably are aware, are essentially our global template programs that contain all the information that the collector uses to know exactly what to monitor on a host, and then also what communication protocols it should use to get the information. And it's also how often the metrics are collected and even what graphs to show. And there's also, within the data source, you can set all of these global alert thresholds, and all of the predefined thresholds are also set within the data sources. So we just want to figure out what data source we need to look at to get SQL alerts. So for this type of thing, I recommend that you open the Hosts tab in a second browser tab. And this is useful because then you can easily click back and forth just for reference. So I'll go ahead and go to the Host tab, and I just need to locate one of my SQL servers. So I choose the server from the hierarchy on the left, and this will show me a list of all the data sources that are associated with this device. So I can see that clearly 2 of them are specific to the SQL server and the services. And I happen to know that if I look in the event folder, there's also a SQL event source, and this is going to alert on all warning and error level Windows event log SQL events. So for example's sake, let's assume that only alerts that are triggered from the data in these data sources should go to that DB team. I could actually include the full data source names for all 3 of these using that pipe character to act as an AND. Or since I can see that all of these have SQL in the title, I can just set the data source field to match anything containing SQL. So we'll go back to our alert rule, and I'll fill in the data source field to make sure that this rule just matches the SQL specific alerts. So I'll leave the data point, in this case, wildcarded. But note that if we did want to make this even more specific so that it would only apply to a specific metric within one of those data sources, then I could specify a data point as well. So now we have all of our database alerts being sent to our DB escalation chain. The NOC teams are no longer going to get the specific database alerts because remember that an alert only matches one rule. And I know I've repeated that, but that's a very important thing to keep in mind as you're configuring your routing. So it's going to go to the escalation chain of the very first rule that it matches. The alerts for all other devices that are associated with the SQL data source are being routed, and all the alerts for data sources for the production equipment are being routed. However, the alerts for anything in a non-production host group and anything that's not SQL related is not going to go anywhere with the way we have it right now. So the rest of our alerts are going to be in our dev and QA groups, and they're probably not as urgent as alerts for production, so we don't necessarily want to route them the same way. Some of them may be important, but others are probably not going to be time sensitive. And for those types of alerts, we have to decide if we want to turn them off completely or leave them on. If you do leave them on, then obviously you want to use them somehow, so it's kind of about figuring out what sort of format can make them useful to you. So let's look at our rules one more time. And we'll assume that the database team has decided that they want to treat the production database alerts differently than QA database. So all we need to do is edit the existing database rule and make it apply only to production. And since there's just one database team, we don't need to narrow it down any further than that. So we'll just do production and all of its subgroups. So here's our updated rules. And now only the alerts from production are being routed at all. So this, again, does not mean that the QA and dev alerts should be totally ignored. So let's say the database team does want to know about the SQL-related events that happen in those dev and QA groups, but they don't want to be woken up in the middle of the night about it. So what we can do in that case is add another rule, and this is going to be specifically for database, dev, and QA environments. And again, let's pay close attention to the priority to see what's going to happen if we do a couple of different numbers. So if I give it a priority lower than the original database rule, I don't need to worry about specifying a host group. And that's because anything for the production group is already going to have matched that first database rule, and it will already have been routed to the 2-staged DB admin escalation chain. So I'll give it a priority of 50. This way I can leave everything else wildcarded so that it applies to everything except for the data source field. And again, I can put SQL with an asterisk on each side, and that will make sure that the alerts from all of the related data sources are going to match the rule and go to the correct recipient. And then in this case, the resend interval is actually very important. So these alerts are not extremely time sensitive. They're for dev and QA. There's not really a need to have these resent periodically, so I'm going to set the resend interval to 0. And then I'll click Submit to save this rule. Look at the resend interval in the escalation chain here. If I had left it at 30, then this rule would be pointless because it would be doing the exact same thing that the other database rule was initially doing. However, if I have the resend interval at 0, that means it's not ever going to go past the first stage of the escalation chain. So it's acting as a one-stage escalation chain, and then the text and email stage 2 is never going to kick in this case. So it sends one email to the DB admin team, and then even if they don't acknowledge the alert, and even if the condition is still active, it's never going to escalate to stage 2, and it's not ever going to resend that notification. So now let's talk about what to do with the rest of the alerts for dev and QA. We've already created very specific alert rules that are going to route the important information to the correct people. So let's say our dev environment has devices in a few locations, and they handle all of it. So the East and West Coast NOC teams take care of everything that's not database related. They're also not time sensitive. So we don't want to send an email to every single person on both of those teams. That's going to be pointless because basically all it takes is one person to handle these not so critical alerts. So I'm going to add an escalation chain called dev and QA and check the box for a time-based chain. So when you're doing time-based chains, you need to note that there is one time zone for your entire account. Everything that you do in this case is going to be based on that time zone. So if you click your settings tab and then account information, you'll be able to confirm what time zone your account is set to. And unfortunately, it can only be one time zone. In this case, we're working with Pacific time. So obviously, that's pretty important to know when you're working with time-based chains. So we're going to click back over to the escalation chain section and then click to add a subchain. And now we just need to pick which times we want this subchain to apply. So I'll do one Monday through Friday by unchecking Saturday and Sunday. And then I'm going to do 5 a.m. Pacific time through 8:30 a.m. And that is actually 8 a.m. through 11:30 a.m. Eastern time. So that's during business hours for our East Coast team. So I'll click to add a stage. And then I'll just add the East Coast team's email addresses. And then I'll click submit to finalize that chain. And I'm not going to do multiple stages here since the alerts are not going to be as urgent. The next subchain is going to be during business hours for the whole team. And during those hours, anyone from either time zone might respond. So I'll create another subchain that will be active from 8:30 a.m. through 2 p.m. Pacific time. And 2 p.m. Pacific time, obviously, is 5 p.m. Eastern. So we'll assume that's the end of East Coast business hours in a perfect world. And I'll add one more subchain to be active from 2 p.m. through 6 p.m. Pacific. So during these hours, only the West Coast team is going to get the email alerts. Here's my time-based chain. Again, it's all on Pacific time. So 5 a.m. through 8:30 a.m., only East Coast is going to get alerts. 8:30 through 2, everyone gets them. And then 2 through 6, only West Coast. And then I'll click submit. And remember that this chain doesn't do anything on its own. We have to create a rule to let the system know what alerts to send here. So back to alert rules, and I'll add a new rule. I'll create a rule called dev and QA. And then, again, we need to pay attention to priority. So we want to make sure that the database team is still going to get their alerts for the production database and the dev and QA databases. So I want to give this new rule a lower priority than the dev database rule, which is 50. And I want it to be higher than 90 because we don't want the catch-all rules to get these alerts first. So I'll do 60. In this case, I had several subchains, but each chain only had one stage. So unless I want that notification to resend periodically, I can just set the resend interval to 0. So on a side note, theoretically, if you have some dev or QA alerts that are more important or time sensitive than others, we could actually add a stage to our early morning escalation chain so that if no one from the East Coast team does respond within an hour, then the West Coast team does get notified as well. Here is all of the rules that we have so far. I mentioned this earlier, but LogicMonitor's default thresholds are 3 different severity levels. Generally speaking, when we set an alert to be a warning level, that means it probably does not require action right away. So you shouldn't necessarily ignore these, but they're also probably not worth being woken up about in the middle of the night. So maybe instead of treating warning level alerts the same as error and critical alerts, meaning emailing them to multiple recipients, maybe we want to see them in a daily report and then not receive those individual emails at all. So in this case, the priority system comes in very handy because rather than going back through all of these existing rules and then editing them to be specific only to error and critical, set of catch-alls, we can simply add a rule with a higher priority to act as a filter, and then it will catch all the warnings before the other rules get them. I can edit the rule that we have here called warn. And remember, right now it's not really doing anything because it has a very low priority, and it's associated with an empty set of recipients. But if I change the priority from 90 to 10, then it suddenly becomes the first thing the system checks against. So any warning alert from any group, any host, and any data source is going to be picked up by this rule. And this is really a good example of how powerful the priorities are. Let's say I decided I did want warning alerts from production to be emailed out right away. All I would need to do is change the priority to be lower than the rules for the production alerts. So for instance, if I change it to 45, then all the production alerts are going to go to those other groups first. And then only the dev and QA warning alerts are going to be filtered by our warning rule. And this also is a very good illustration of the earlier point of why you should not set priorities that are sequential. Because if you do, anytime you want to add a filter type of alert or just change something so that it's applying in a different order, you would have to change all of your priorities if you had done them sequential. And then it also kind of illustrates the point that you shouldn't think of priorities as the importance of the individual alert rules. The more specific a rule, the higher priority it should have. So as you can see from this example, routing warnings to the empty set of recipients is probably not the most important thing that's happening, but it is the one with the highest priority because we want it to be checked against that rule before anything else. So let's set up a report that shows us the warning alerts since we're not emailing them out anymore. So we'll click on the Reports tab, and you can see that there are two predefined reports. Every account comes with these two reports, and they're very powerful, and I recommend that everyone sets these up for auto delivery. They're some of the most useful tools for figuring out what information you need to see and what information you don't. For now, we're just going to use this one, all alerts from last 24 hours, and we'll use this as a starting point. Right now, you can see it's set to show all alerts. So we'll just change the title to all warning alerts. And then we'll change the level so it's only warn instead of all. And we will check the box to deliver the report via email. Since it's a 24-hour report, I'm going to pick every day for the delivery. And then I just need to select the recipient. So if you want it to go to people that aren't already users in LogicMonitor, you can just enter the email addresses in that arbitrary box at the bottom. So here is a quick view of this alert report. So you can see that all of the information about the alert is there, including the start and the end times, and the rule that it was associated with. So on this report here, you probably noticed that it shows a couple of critical as well as warnings. This is just a screenshot to give you, an example of what these reports show, but it's obviously different than the one that we created in the previous example. The report is one good way to check which rule is going to match a particular type of alert. And if you want to check a whole bunch of rules at once to make sure that the alerts are going to match them, a report is a good way to do that. But another quicker way to make sure that you have your rules and your priorities set up correctly is to go back to the Hosts tab and then click on any host that you want to test the routing for. So we'll go back to Hosts, and then we'll look at this device here, and I can test on any of these data sources to see how these are going to be routed based on my current alert rule setup. So I'll click the wrench icon, and then I'll choose Manage Alerts and Thresholds. This shows me all of the individual data points or individual metrics that are part of this data source. And this one I clicked on here is the ping data source. And you can also see in here which ones actually have thresholds set at all. So remember that if there's not a threshold, then that metric will not ever go into alert status. So we're actually going to be doing another webinar focusing more specifically on working with data sources and data points. So if you are interested in a more in-depth look at data source manipulation and how to figure out which data point you want to set thresholds on, plan on attending that webinar too, and we can send out more information about that a bit later. So we'll click the Show Alert Routing button next to any of these. And you can do that even if it doesn't have a threshold set on it. It will still work. So this shows us that our warning alerts for this data source and this host are going to match the rule called warn, which means that the warnings aren't going to be routed, but they will show up in our report. And then the other levels are matching against the US West production chain, so they're going to be sent to the West NOC escalation chain. And that's exactly what we were expecting. So this tells me that my rules are set up correctly for this scenario. So basically, kind of to start summarizing, if you are getting overwhelmed with too many notifications and you're not really sure what to suppress, the first thing you should do is get rid of the catch-all rules and then start using a report instead. So I want to quickly show you a couple of tips and tricks that will help you figure out what to route and what to turn off, and then kind of a few ways of using the escalation chain stages and the recent interval to your advantage. So I'm going to show you the alert frequency report. This is the other default report in your account. And I've actually blurred out the names of the hosts because this is a real report from a client that I worked with recently. This is default in your account, and it's extremely useful. So right away, we can see where most of the noise is coming from. In this case, it looks like it's SQL event logs for 3 different hosts. And then we also have quite a few CPU busy % alerts. So if there's anything here that does not need to be addressed immediately, it's probably going to be way more useful in a report like this instead of having upwards of 2,000 emails or texts. When you get this report, if you see something that you want to research further or that you think should have probably been routed via email, you can drill down by just editing that report to show all the alerts from whatever data source you want to look at. And that way you can see the full information and then also the value that triggered it. So here I have just the Win CPU alert. This is the kind of thing that is definitely good to know about, but I probably wouldn't want an email for each one of these, since if I did get an email notifying me that the CPU for one of my devices is at 72%, I'm probably not going to immediately address that. So in this case, it's more useful when I view it in a report format, and then it also saves my inbox from being flooded with all of these emails. So we're getting close to the end of our time, and I do want to leave some time for questions. It's almost time to wrap up, but let's take a look at a couple more useful tricks for just how you can use the escalation chain stages to kind of accomplish a few other scenarios. Here is an escalation chain that has recipients in the first 2 stages, and it is followed by 3 empty stages. And then there's another stage with recipients and another empty stage. So the resend interval, which is set in the alert rule, is what determines how many minutes the system is going to wait before escalating the alert to the next recipient. So if we wanted an alert to be emailed out, followed by a text in 10 minutes, but then we don't want the text to be resent every 10 minutes, we can do something like this. So here's the rule associated with that chain. And so you can see it's going to email Jonathan and Charles, and then it will wait 10 minutes, and then it texts them. And then it's going to wait 30 minutes because you can see 3 empty stages with a 10-minute resend interval, so 10 minutes between stages. And then it's going to send them another text and another email. And note that the last stage is also empty. So since the resend interval means it's going to resend to the final stage every 10 minutes, if we don't want that, we can accomplish this with an empty final stage. I also wanted to mention event log events. By default, LogicMonitor alerts on any Windows event that has a higher severity level than informational. So any warning or error Windows event log is going to trigger an alert. Those can tend to get noisy, and that's why I wanted to specifically point this out. And a lot of times I'll see alert floods, as we call them, that people have based on Windows events. So you don't necessarily want to ignore your events. So maybe don't turn them off, but if you just want to make sure you're not getting emailed about every single one, what you can do is something like I have here. So I specified event for the data source with a wildcard on each side. And that's basically going to make sure that the rule matches all Windows event log events, plus all Exchange events, SQL events, and IIS events. But remember that if you're going to choose to filter these out from being routed, but you are specifically choosing to leave them turned on, then you do want to still see the information. Otherwise, it's not going to do you any good at all. So you should set up a report so that you're still going to get the info. And then if you're not going to look at it at all, just disable the event sources. And that's another best practice, is that if there's something that you really don't care about in the long run, rather than just not routing it, you should just disable that data source or that event source. And that will not only suppress the alerts, but it won't be in your account at all. So finally, let's take a quick example of maybe a one-man shop. So if you don't have multiple locations or large teams that handle your alerts or that are responsible for your equipment, you still don't want to receive them all in the same way, because you want to make sure you're receiving the information in the way that's most valuable for using it. So if you are the only person that's handling the alerts, here's a sample of what we could do. You can see there's an email and SMS escalation chain that does have both the email and the SMS in the first stage. That's probably for pretty important alerts if we want to get the SMS message right away. We also have an email and then SMS, which means we'll send out the email and then give him a chance to acknowledge the alert or fix it before we escalate that to the SMS message. And then there's also the voice and email. So if it's extremely critical, maybe we want to do a voice call right off the bat. But again, that's not going to be for everything. If we just put that into those default rules, then that means every single alert is going to trigger a voice call, and that's not ideal. And then finally, we have email only for the alerts that are probably less important, but he does still want to know about them. That pretty much wraps up our examples in this webinar. We are going to be doing another session for the advanced alert routing features, and this is going to include custom alert delivery methods and types of integration. So if you're interested in that, you can email client.services@logicmonitor.com, or feel free to contact me directly as well, and then we can make sure to include you on the list for that webinar. If you have any other questions, please feel free to shoot an email to either myself or client.services@logicmonitor.com, and we'll follow up with you also after the webinar here, and we'll have a few survey questions for you, so we'd really appreciate any feedback. And I also wanted to point out that we're actually in the process of redoing a few things about our alert routing system. We're going to be changing it so that you'll be able to configure the rules in the escalation chain kind of in the same screen so that they're all set up together. At this point right now, we wanted to make sure that people understand how to use it the way it is, but be aware that in the next few months we are going to be doing a redesign of some of these features. If you guys would like to ask questions out loud, you can actually raise your hand and we can unmute you. And then otherwise, feel free to follow up via email.